Good evening and welcome to the 10th Annual National Agenda Speaker Series. I'm Lindsay Hoffman, I'm the director of the Speaker Series, and this year's theme calls attention to the power of us as citizens of the United States. Even in this tumultuous time, our right to vote in elections remains one of the most important acts we can perform as Americans. Our first national agenda without boundaries, if you want to call it that, drew over 400 viewers. Tonight, we're continuing the conversation of where fact and fiction merge, a timely topic given last night's unusual presidential debate. National Agenda is all about demonstrating civil dialogue and engaging with the community. Even though we are virtual this fall, we will be inviting audience participation. So throughout the program, to submit a question, type your question into the chat function and it may be selected during our Q&A at the end of the talk. Tonight, as you saw, we have an exciting slate of speakers tonight, but we'll start with two successful writers and producers of political dramas like Homeland, 24, House of Cards, and The X-Files, a personal favorite. Please welcome Howard Gordon and John Mankiewicz.
Hi, everybody. Hi.
Hi, nice to see you.
Good to see you guys.
Do we have Howard yet?
Where is Howard? I don't see Howard on my screen. Let's see if he's coming.
Okay.
There,
oh,
there's Eric.
There's Eric. Hi, Eric. You know, in these times, things don't always work out exactly as you plan them to. So let's just start the conversation. Thank you for joining us virtually, Eric Deggans, NPR TV, first NPR full-time TV critic, and John Mankiewicz, who is a well-known Hollywood producer and writer. We have nearly 600 folks who signed up for this call from Delaware to California to Brazil. And we've got Steve Schmidt joining us as well. So this is wonderful. Hi, Steve. You're on mute. This is the new phrase for 2020, right?
Yep. We should just have a sign that you hold up.
Hello.
Hi, Steve.
How are you?
Great. Great to have you back again as a UD alum. So our viewers tonight are over 600 people, nearly 600 people, UD alumni, faculty, staff, retirees, students, and many who are not affiliated with UD.
Okay.
So thanks to all of those of you who are joining us tonight. I also want to thank UD's Department of Political Science and International Relations. Thank you, David Redlosk, as well as the Department of Communication. Thank you, Kimmy Silk, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. And a big welcome to a first National Agenda history. We're welcoming students from politics and entertainment class at Loyola University of Maryland, taught by Dr. Amy Becker. So welcome to you guys from Loyola. So let's start with the obvious. About last night.
We have to talk about last night.
I commented to my friends that it looked like a Saturday Night Live sketch, and except less funny.
Right.
And entertaining as it might have been, could you have scripted or imagined anything scripted like this? Would any writer think about portraying a president and a former vice president engaged in such a wrangle?
No. I mean, just no. If you, I mean, 2 weeks ago, maybe if the assignment had gone out, that version could possibly be written, but it's such an extreme version of that.
So it was surprising to you. Eric?
Once it started and it was clear what his strategy was, it wasn't that surprising. I was surprised that people were surprised because, ultimately what Trump does is he creates chaos and confusion in order to frustrate people who believe in the institutions that he is subverting. So part of what he was doing last night was creating so much confusion that, people who might be undecided or for some reason, can't bring themselves to choose between these two guys might just throw up their hands and kind of give up on the whole process and say, well, I'm not going to learn anything from this debate, or this debate doesn't really matter because I can't tell what's going on, as opposed to allowing for an actual debate where people might actually compare these two guys and their outlooks and their strategies and make a decision. And so I think, his team is throwing a lot of things at the wall because they know that he's losing. And one of the things that I think he tried to do was try to throw Biden off his game, but also just try to devalue the actual debate itself so that people might give up on it. And indeed, by the end of it, you had Wolf Blitzer predicting that there might not be another debate because that one was so terrible.
Well, and Steve, can you give us some insight onto the Commission on Presidential Debates is saying, we need to change the rules on this. I mean, is that unprecedented?
Of course it is. The debate was a singular disgrace and a moment of profound national humiliation that comforted every adversary in the world and horrified our allies. And I think there was nothing funny about it at all. It was a shameful event. And the person to blame for that singularly is Donald Trump. There should be no equivalence. There's no wrangle between Trump and the vice president. There were rules in place. Donald Trump blew through the rules. So unless you're going to strap an electric shock collar to his ankle and put it up to full voltage, or you're going to give the moderator the power to turn off the mic, none of this is of any import. What we saw last night was a president who is losing this election. One of the dominant features of this campaign is that Joe Biden's lead, which is the largest, the broadest, and the most durable in modern presidential history, is being significantly discounted by a national press that was deeply surprised and embarrassed by the wrong predictions in 2016. There's a mythology about the 2016 election that the polls were wrong. The polls were not wrong. Polls were precisely accurate. It had Hillary Clinton up by 2.5 points. That's what she won by. What was true in 2016 is that whomever the election was about was the person who was losing the election. And the person who was losing the election for 98% of it, until James Comey intervened and made it about Hillary Clinton in the last week, was Donald Trump. And that intervention at the last minute in that last week gave Trump enough margin for victory. But you saw someone last night who's decomposing, saw someone who's unraveling, someone who's losing, someone whose political position will worsen significantly as a result of the debate. Look for a 3 to 4 point spread, which was a huge number given how inelastic the race is with regard to undecided voters. We're seeing out of the Lincoln Project now deterioration in Trump's poll numbers among his last stalwart group, which is non-college educated white men. So that was a disaster last night. But before we go too much further, I think the meaning of the debate deserves a comment. And only one thing that happened last night truly matters, and it happened at the end, is Donald Trump, in essence, gave a lock and load order to heavily armed white supremacist paramilitary militia organizations. They've been celebrating it all day long. No Republican senators have gone out and directly condemned Trump for this. He also intimated that there would be bad things that happen, that there would be violence, that there will not be a peaceful transition of power if he loses the election. The evidence of a fraudulent election, according to Trump, is the fact that he loses the election. And so when we look at 4 years of the demolition of institutions, norms, conduct, the total complicity and surrender to a cult of personality by the co-equal branches of government that are supposed to keep a check on Trump, there's only one line now left for anybody to cross after the lack of condemnation for last night. And it would be the order that Trump would give. It would be the demand that Trump would make on these senators or congressmen to say, cross the final line and help maintain me in power despite my rejection by a vote and an expression of the popular sovereign will of the American people. That's the Rubicon. We're at the edge of the river. How many of them are going to cross that river? And we should be deeply worried that it's a hell of a lot of them. It's coming. Nobody should misunderstand the direct implications of what Trump said. He should be taken both literally and seriously about his threats to America's democratic institutions and the 244-year tradition of the peaceful transition of power.
Well, Steve, if I can stay with you for a moment, you ran McCain's campaign in 2008 and were instrumental in selecting his running mate, only the second female vice presidential nominee and the first Republican, Sarah Palin. Palin has provided commentary for Fox News, starred in reality shows, and endorsed Donald Trump for president in 2016. Knowing all that you know now, what would you tell Steve Schmidt in 2008 about Sarah Palin?
In 2008, Steve Schmidt was 37 years old, and I was put in charge of a campaign and given responsibility for everything except two things: the vetting and the selection of the vice president and the conclusion of the Republican National Convention. I found out that Sarah Palin couldn't pick Iraq out of a map 3 days after she was selected. What I would have told Steve Schmidt at 37, that being in charge means being in charge of everything. I am the person at a meeting who said, after Joe Lieberman was dropped from consideration because of a leak by Lindsey Graham, that we should take a look at Sarah Palin. I said that with the disclosure that I knew very little about her, with the exception that she was the most popular governor in the country with an 87% approval level. And the two remaining candidates on the list, Tim Pawlenty and Mitt Romney, would not get done what we needed to get done in a very difficult election season. From the moment the 2008 campaign ended, I have spoken out against the populism, the nationalism, the birtherism, the know-nothingism, the metastatic cancer that has consumed the Republican Party over the last 11 years and turned it into an autocratic party that exists according to its platform now for one purpose. There's one requirement in the party platform. It's obedience and loyalty to Trump. So what I've said for the last 11 or 12 years is that all of this collectively is a great danger to the country. And I'll keep saying it. She is a fool and a buffoon and a liar and an embarrassment. And John McCain, I'm sure, was mortified to the hour that he took his last conscious breath about having picked her. We all are. But she is not a straight line from Trump to Sarah Palin. What she represents is this moment in American life where disbelief of the obvious became virtuous inside the Republican Party, because everybody knew that she was a fool. Everybody said it in the green rooms. Everybody said it at the parties. Everybody said it to everyone all the time. But when it came to having a camera in their face, people were afraid of having Sarah Palin's Facebook troll write a mean post about them. So we live in an age of political cowardice, unlike any other era in American history, where we have an entire elected class of leaders who are terrified of being tweeted at by Donald Trump, and have let an era of corruption, of meanness, of cruelty, of idiocy loose in this country. If we had the same mortality rate as did Germany, we'd have 150,000 fewer dead Americans in this country. Donald Trump's lie about the lethality of COVID is the greatest lie in the history of the United States. It has killed at a minimum at least 100,000 Americans. And before it's done, we'll have another 200,000 dead Americans. We have a shattered economy. We have a million broken dreams. We have the education of every child in this country disrupted. And we have fundamentally ended the American way of life. Grandparents will not be going to see their grandkids being born. There will be no bar mitzvahs and first communions for them to attend this year, nor high school graduations or proms, no New Year's Eve parties, no tailgates, none of it, because of the fool that sits behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office. Donald Trump attacked me for the first time in 2012 when I called him the head clown of the Republican clown car, and denounced him for his birtherism. But we are at a moment in this country where American democracy is imperiled. And anybody who doesn't think that is so is naive and clearly and plainly unwilling to listen to the plain meaning of the words that come out of Donald Trump's mouth.
If I could interject, I'd say right on top of that, and I agree with everything that Steve has said, is the complicity of Fox News and conservative-oriented media outlets that have supported the untruths and the lies that Trump has foisted on the American people. And it was quite striking to look at the cable channels after the debate last night, see anchors on CNN who were horrified by what had happened, and then turn to Fox News and see Sean Hannity calling Donald Trump a lion, calling Donald Trump a gladiator, trying to downplay the disruption of what he had done and talk about how virtuous it was that he came out as a tough guy swinging at a competitor. You cannot discount how Fox News has, over a dozen years, propagandized a portion of the American electorate so that they do not believe the accurate reporting that comes from mainstream news outlets, and that they only trust the slanted and ideological reporting and pronouncements that come from people like Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Fox and Friends, and on and on and on. And it means that even if Donald Trump loses the election in November and leaves office the way he's supposed to, there will still be 30 to 40% of the electorate who will believe that he should have won, and will still be a force that we'll have to contend with in terms of trying to rebuild the country and rebuild our democratic norms if he does leave office. So we can never underestimate the impact of conservative media, and in particularly Fox News, in enabling this behavior.
Well, let's get back to the kind of theme of the conversation tonight. What impact does Hollywood's portrayal of presidents in shows like House of Cards or other programs impact people's perceptions of what a president should be or what a president should do? I'll open this to Howard and John.
I thought House of Cards was over when Trump got elected. I mean, he so surpassed the Underwood administration that, that the House of Cards was impossible to keep going. I mean, it did for another year, but it was a much different show. I mean, Underwood operated, he wouldn't say the things that he was thinking out loud the way Trump does. And frankly, last night with the Proud Boys thing, and he's going to have people watching polls and intimidating voters, it was I was as shocked and alarmed as Steve is.
I'd be interested in asking Howard. I'm going to reveal that when I talk about this stuff, I often say to people that I felt that 24, for example, helped people picture that a Black man could be president in America. We saw Dennis Haysbert's character in that position years before Barack Obama was actually elected. And we also saw Morgan Freeman depicted as president in the movie Deep Impact. Both figures that you trusted, that you liked, played by likable actors. And I've always said that TV teaches us how to dream. And I wonder, Howard, what you think about this notion that maybe by having Dennis Haysbert play that character, that it may have helped people imagine a not too distant future where we can have a Black president.
Yeah, I think the stories over the years in film and television have absolutely been aspirational and have helped us discover as a country and as a society, our better selves. Even I think the polls. I think there was an interesting Norman Lear Center poll about interracial marriage. Actually, in apparently in like 1968, 3% of the country found interracial marriage acceptable, and by the early 80s or late 80s, they repolled and 80. It was something like 82%, and causally it was Look Who's Coming to Dinner, and those and various stories that had imagined that. And I think it without sounding too self-important, I know Dennis Haysbert loves the idea that he was helped imagine. He has a great picture of himself as you walk up to his office, where President Obama. It's a famous picture of Obama, and then it actually is pointing to a portrait of David himself on the higher level. So yeah, but now that the sort of the engine has come out of the hood and has sprung a leak and unspooled itself, it becomes impossible. John said that House of Cards ended at a time when we can't even imagine anymore, and it's hard to even it's hard to fathom what place myth making and storytelling has anymore in this circus. And I mean, you mentioned to Steve's point that the media, their complicity in this, but I still can't get over the simple fact, Steve, that you think, I mean, that the Republicans who are complicit in this, in their own silence, these sworn public servants is it mirrored? I mean, and the only you mentioned they're being tweeted at and their fear of being targeted by Trump. But it seems so much deeper and so much more. My incredulity is not over Trump so much as them, and so I guess I find that the things that I've done in the past are increasingly impossible. I can't even imagine creating a president anymore. I've written 8 or 9 fictional presidents between Homeland and 24, and I can't, when I think about doing that again, it's almost impossible to imagine where you'd begin.
Yeah, that's my question too, is like, what does the next fictional president look like?
Well, I'll say this is that, I'd get asked the question a lot, like, is working in a White House, at that level, like, is it like House of Cards? And I would always tell people, no, like, it's like Veep.
Yeah.
Veep is the most accurate movie about what it's really like. And, the reality is you got a lot of Jonahs up there on Capitol Hill, to say the least. And, no, but I think that from an art perspective and movie perspective, of course, it's, people looked, at both the presidents that Morgan Freeman played and, Dennis Haysbert played, at a time where trust was collapsing in public institutions in this country, and has been for a long time. And you can go back to the 1960s and, understand that. In fact, a lot of the things that we fight over today in this country are rooted in the Great Divide that occurred when the country sent its Black, brown, and poor white kids to fight and die in a war in Vietnam that was premised on lies, that was unwinnable, while the Donald Trumps of the world got out of service. And that divide that existed culturally has played out through all of the baby boomer presidencies. And Donald Trump is exploiting it full circle at the level of intensity plus some that you would have expected from a late 1960s George Wallace. And that's exactly what this is. This is the George Wallace presidency. And so, the truth of the matter is that, my belief is he's the worst president in the history of the country. It took a lot of time to move James Buchanan off of that list. And a lot of people forget how terrible Buchanan was because of the greatness of what followed after him, which was Abraham Lincoln. But arguably, the 2 worst presidents in the country's history are sandwiched on either side of the greatest president in the country's history. What's always been true about the country, almost providentially, is that it's produced the right leaders at the right moments. Dwight Eisenhower was a colonel in the Army who hadn't been promoted in 13 years in 1940. At the beginning of the Civil War, a Union colonel named William Tecumseh Sherman wrote a letter to a friend of his. The friend of his was down and out on his luck and was selling firewood on a corner in Ohio. And Sherman wrote to his friend Ulysses Grant that he thought Abraham Lincoln was a backwoods barbarian, that he had none of the skills and none of the intuitions or education required to save the Union at this moment of crisis. The last time that Sherman saw Lincoln was with Grant at the headwaters camp on the James River of the Union Army at City Point. And he recalled Lincoln after his assassination, and he said that he possessed more of the qualities of greatness and goodness than any man I had ever met, and said he had met all the great men of the world, all the kings and emperors, generals and industrialists. There was a woman one day who was just too tired to give up her bus seat when they told her to go to the back of the bus. She was an ordinary person. She inspired a young preacher at the Ebenezer Baptist Church to stand up for justice, and he became a universally admired moral giant whose legacy instructs us today. All through the history of the country, in moments of crisis, people have stood up. And so what I would say about Trump, if you were imagining a president, and I'll tell you about the one I think we're going to have, because I think he has a lot of qualities and similar to the 33rd president of the United States. The 33rd president of the United States was a plain-spoken man from Missouri. He had been vice president for less than 100 days, didn't have a lot to do, had no idea about the atomic weapons program. He was playing cards with his friend, the Speaker, Sam Rayburn, and he got a call from the White House. And he ditched his one Secret Service agent and he fast walked down Constitution Avenue, walked into the White House, went to the East Room, and Eleanor Roosevelt was waiting there for him. And she said, "Harry, the president is dead." And Harry Truman said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, is there anything I can do for you?" And she looked at him and said, "No, Mr. President, is there anything I can do for you?" And Harry Truman remembered that he felt the weight of the moon, the stars, and all the heavens fall onto his shoulders. And he was one of the giants of the American presidency. So what comes next after Trump may be very surprising. But we look at the life of Joe Biden, we look at the tragedy, the suffering, we look at the empathy gained, we look at the optimism that comes from someone who's looked into the darkest nights. That's what this country needs. And if I was casting a president, I would look for the qualities of greatness and goodness, because these forces now are struggling against each other. And in America, the side that's on the side of liberty, justice, and expansion of freedoms has never been defeated by the forces that are arrayed around Trump, none of which, by the way, are new in the history of the American story, but they have never prevailed before. They have never taken power. That's what happened in 2016. And now the great question before the country, and understand, it is a great question. It's the most important election since 1864 in this country. We will decide whether to validate this, because the people that are on the side of Trump, who looked at that performance last night, stand on the side of ugly characteristics: bullying, meanness, blustering, lying, indecency, incompetence. And that's what the choice is. And it's a big one in this election, and it's coming very, very fast.
You know, if I could break in, one thing that struck me about the fictional depictions of the presidency and of politics is that Hollywood has not done a great job of portraying the intense partisanship that we're stuck in right now. And when I think about Veep, for example, they de-emphasize political parties. to amp up the comedy. The West Wing never really dealt with partisanship particularly well. The Newsroom, which showed journalists covering politics, also didn't deal with partisanship very well, because that kind of partisanship tended to defuse a lot of the stories they were trying to tell. You know, if you have something like a Supreme Court justice dying months before or weeks before an election, and you know that the Republicans are going to vote in lockstep and put another justice on the court, that diffuses the tension, and you can't play it for tension in a fictional setting. I wonder what some of our you know, TV writing panelists think about this, but I have always been disappointed in that I've never felt fictional TV has done a great job in depicting the intense partisanship that we've been stuck in over the last, you know, dozen years or so. And so it makes it harder to create a believable president, because you have these presidents who are operating in a fictional environment that doesn't exist in the real world, where they can cut deals with Democrats, or indeed you're not even necessarily sure what party they belong to.
That's a great question. Howard or John?
Well, I think you know, the interesting part about fiction, these fictional analogs, are that they, you know, we're really we're mirroring it, but not, or we're reflecting it, but not quite mirroring it. And I don't think Jed Bartley or Frank Underwood did you name them? I don't know whether, I mean, we can imagine what they were, but I don't think their party affiliation or the partisanship tends to be kind of undermined. Once you start naming it, it changes the rules of this fictional construct. And so, you know, it tends to be much more about, you know, imagining those moments with Jed Bartley, you know, President, was that his name? I forgot.
Bartlett. Yeah, Jed Bartlett. Yeah. On the West Wing.
Yeah. And so the partisanship and the ugliness of it is almost, and the back, once you start naming it, you start drawing the analogies, and then it sort of gets reduced to polemic or to partisan. You're now just an echo chamber for something, and so you have this weird dance that you're doing, and you're trying to avoid it and get to the essential truth of it, or get to the emotional truth of it, or the dramatic essence of where does a human being interact with these impossible choices without declaring your own bias, which, you know, of course informs you. I was telling the students before that one of the great parts of being a writer here is that, you know, is making people just think differently than they might otherwise have about the world we're living in, about the choices they're having to make as citizens and as Americans, in a way that is, you know, not a white paper or an article or a documentary. I think you experience stories in a much more emotional and accessible way that hopefully expands your, you know, your understanding. But you're right. I think it's a very good observation, and I don't have a good answer. But
it's frankly not.
I've talked anyway.
It's not that interesting to have that kind of division. Dramatically, if someone, like, I can't get over. You just talk about immigration. I don't know how you can get all those people in the White House who somehow agree that it's okay to put kids in cages and do what happened. I mean, you would think that's not a world I can really imagine. You know, it's that no one says, hey, we're not doing this anymore. You know, this is wrong. Or Steve's talking about the Republicans who know about Trump's taxes and are still for a guy who owes, you know, $400 million in the next few years to God knows who. You know, I mean, that's a big liability. Do they really only care about, you know, the three issues, you know, the judges, abortion, and you know, it's just, it's not realistically dramatic in a way that makes you want to write about it, to fictionalize it.
Well,
I mean, that's something that always surprised me about House of Cards, for example. Frank Underwood was cutting deals that would not be possible in the real world, because Republicans would never work with him.
Right.
And that was the one thing that always used to trip me up sometimes when I was watching these incredibly intricate House of Cards, you know, machinations that Frank Underwood was pulling together. I'm just like, Republicans wouldn't do that. They wouldn't go along with it.
Right. but it was interesting dramatically to see how you pursued it. And, we've tried to stay, we had consultants like Steve, people, I send regards from Mark Salter, who lives right down the street from me here in Maine, who would tell us, how the Senate rules worked, and the most arcane Senate rule that would allow Underwood to get his vote passed, and with senators out of town, and or arrest senators and bring them back to Washington. It was all within the norms that Trump just ignores.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah, how much?
Sorry.
I was just gonna say, how much do you rely on like actual politicians and political strategists and things like that for shows like Homeland and House of Cards?
Well, Homeland really, I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, Homeland is certainly, if it's more of a policy show, and sort of both shows are kind of more, less about politics and more about policy, or at least that's sort of the grist for the mill that, for us. So it's not quite like West Wing or like House of Cards for that matter. So we use a lot of spies and Pentagon people, and
like you actually interview them and talk to them.
Yeah.
We had this great thing called Spy Camp, which I think I talked about before. We used to go every year and spend 5 days, kind of from 9 in the morning till 9 at night, in this old Georgetown club where people sort of had we traipsed everyone from former CIA heads to generals to journalists, and everyone sort of told us what scared them most, and that became often the substance of a season.
It felt like you guys would tap into stuff. You would write scripts about things, and then the episodes would air, and they would actually be happening in our government at that time. I was always amazed at how you could. You wrote the Russian, meddling storyline before we knew it was happening. You wrote a lot of that. I was always amazed at how you guys were able to, whatever they told you in those CIA meetings, you seemed to be ahead of the curve when you were.
Well, writing. I mean, but they're very. I mean, it takes a long time for those stories to develop, and for those journalists who were kind of, giving us a peek at their notebooks at that time, and then the stories would break. I mean, we knew that, for instance, this season on Homeland, which took 18 months to write and produce, was about the wind down, or at least the drawing down of troops in Afghanistan, and that was I called Zal Khalilzad, who I know from a policy group, for information, and then he never returned my email, and it was because he'd been deployed to as the actual peace negotiator, for us. So he wasn't able to share his story because he was actually over there doing it. So.
Well, Steve, if I can come back to you, you live politics day in and day out. Do you watch political dramas?
Watch them all?
You watch them all?
I watch them all, of course.
Do you think they portray?
Like Homeland's just like, I mean, anybody, like any of the students, anyone, I mean, it is one of the greatest shows in the golden age of television. I mean, it's an extraordinary series. Fantastic. But I watch everything.
Do you think that they portray the president and the White House realistically, or are they overly dramatic?
Well, it's a fictional accounting of what's happening around characters in the real world that's utterly and completely believable. And so, I said 4 years ago that I thought that there was a real lack of imagination in the American mind about the capacity for great tragedy in this country caused by someone like Trump. So, if I said to you a year ago that we'd have 200,000 dead Americans, a broken economy, the president would be threatening the peaceful transition of power, that the Republican Party as party had completely become a cult of personality, had become illiberal in its orientation, had become authoritarianish, right? You know, would that have been more outlandish or less outlandish than the, you know, sphere of the fiction that takes place in some of these, you know, in some of these shows? You know, I think, you know, in 24, you know, I was a huge fan of 24. It, you know, redefined a genre of television. Hadn't been a show like that. It was a phenomenon. But yeah, I think that you know, all of these shows are like really good quality shows, and all of them were pretty accurate around the trappings of the presidency and the senior level government officials that, you know, make policy. And, you know, they were incredible shows.
You know what's interesting to note, to think about what kind of characterizations may come next. We've just seen Showtime debut this show called The Comey Rule, and someone's talked about it in the comments here. I watched it in advance, and one of the things that was interesting to me about it was that even though it's based on Jim Comey's book, it's not really about exonerating his position. Like that docudrama tries to talk about the mounting horror that people in the FBI felt when they realized that how corrupt some of the people around Trump were, how they might be leveraged by the Russians, and how little they knew about why Trump was acting the way he was towards Putin. And it also makes the case that that Steve just said earlier, that Comey fumbled how he handled the public face of the investigation into Hillary Clinton, and it cost her the election, which is something you wouldn't expect from a docudrama that's based on a book that was written by Jim Comey. But that's what I think we're going to see some of as we get past this election, is docudramas that try to take us into the room and give us a sense of what actually has been happening in the Trump White House in these, John talked about it, how can people sit in a conference room and hear about kids being put in cages? I think some people are going to try to dramatize that and show us how that happened. And I'm really interested in seeing what people come up with.
Well, and let me direct this back to Howard and John. What impact do shows about Washington or the president or politics, American politics, have on Americans' perceptions of our government? I mean, are we in this situation, which is kind of dramatic right now in 2020, because of how Washington is portrayed? In other words, does programming like some of the programs that you created lead to candidates and presidents like Trump, who was once a reality star? Or is this just I'm an academic, so is it correlation or causation? Do we see that is this related? Like, the more we view presidents being like on House of Cards, that we're more okay with that kind of behavior from a president?
I don't think so. But I think it's all Howard's fault, really. I mean, it's Homeland.
I think it's Mark Zuckerberg's fault. I really do think that. I think we cannot.
Mark Zuckerberg and Rupert Murdoch.
And Mark, don't forget Mark Burnett.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Yes, Mark Burnett.
Yes. But we had a hacker come to the House of Cards writers' room and tell us, and look, I don't think we ever knew his real name, and he was there to take his pet project. He was going to see if he could take over all the screens in Times Square. I don't know what he was going to do with them, but I don't know if he did it or not. But he gave us this storyline. I think the Underwoods used Facebook, your Facebook account. If you saw a picture of the Underwoods in an ad, they used an algorithm to make the Underwoods look a little bit like you, like each Facebook user. I think that's, it seemed crazy to me at the time, but a lot of the stuff that we were writing about, I mean, I was in Italy writing an episode about, at the same time, when that plane crash was shot down in Ukraine, and they wouldn't let us come look at the crash site. I forget whose plane it was. We were doing the exact same story at the same time. So it's, I mean, world events, I think Howard would agree that, that there are things in the air that we write about and real life kind of become, that bleed into real life and become real life. But I don't think anyone watched Frank Underwood and thought, well, this makes it a little bit more okay for someone like Trump.
Yeah, I mentioned this before, but there's a couple systemic things, and we talk about causalities. I think the fact that we view television, again, never at the same time on the same night, and I think has been actually pretty, well, not catastrophic for, certainly for the networks, but also for the culture and for the society, when we actually, could mediate or curate some kind of public conversation, and the shows lived in our imaginations, and we lived with these characters at the same time, so we could talk about them. And then when streaming and binging and and this sort of, I think this is a really unhealthy, and people love the choice, I guess, on one hand, but I find it terrible that and there's no event, there's no conversation happening, and then at the same time social media has just completely steamrolled not just our attention spans, but our capacity for thinking. I think we're just
Streaming has had the opposite effect. It's a competition to see who can watch these shows the fastest, and it's, spoiler alert, I'm not going to talk to you about it. There's no community really about.
I always say binging, which people don't seem to like. No one seems to take offense at the word binging. I find binging like, who wants to eat? I want to go to a restaurant and get a menu and order. I want to get there hungry, and I want to leave looking forward to the next time I can order a meal. Who the hell wants to eat, 70 breakfast, lunch, dinner, breakfast, lunch, dinner, breakfast, lunch, dinner over a 12-hour period? You get sick.
You yourself admitted that you were binging Stranger Things this weekend.
No, I didn't. I said, no. You missed it. I miscommunicated.
Oh.
I've never seen Stranger Things. I've never seen it. I've seen 3 episodes.
I would say that in terms of media influencing people, I do think that people realize when they're watching scripted television that they are watching a constructed reality, and that the impact on them may be more subtle. I'm particularly concerned about so-called reality TV shows. We had a joking reference to Mark Burnett in The Apprentice, but it is obvious that Trump fabricated an image for himself that he then used to sell himself as a presidential candidate. But beyond that, when you look at shows like Live PD and Cops, you have them presenting a constructed reality in terms of how policing works in America that can blind people to how it actually works and who actually is being hurt by it. But I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I think by extension that goes to cable news, and that goes to television news, and that goes to the way in which these media outlets have been manufacturing a reality that tells certain people that the way they see the world is the way the world is, even though it's not true. And one of the things Fox News does in particular is deny the existence of systemic racism. Like, that didn't start with Trump. That is something that the founder of Fox News, Roger Ailes, has often felt and often articulated, and has been expressed through the work of people like Bill O'Reilly and Glenn Beck and Laura Ingraham and Megyn Kelly. And now here we are with Sean Hannity, the biggest star in cable TV news, who absolutely does not believe in systemic racism, and is sort of propagandizing a sizable portion of the audience to believe that as well. And I think that those kinds of products influence people more than watching The West Wing or watching.
But Eric, even more than just sort of than ascribing whatever platform. I mean, I think the fact of 24-hour news, I think we can take it further back, the Ted Turner, just the fact that once again, we were deluged, they were forced to come up with more news than there was, or to, and so it created a kind of very unhealthy habituation. And I think social media is now an extension of that madness.
Yep,
so
very much so.
So yeah, we're seeing this kind of confluence of fact and fiction sort of coming together and increasing difficulty and kind of differentiating between the two. Let's flip the question about how this happened or what causes what, and look to the future. I have questions for my students. My student Mia wants to know, how will the story of 2020 be told on TV?
Go ahead.
There was a show that I'd recommend that was an HBO 90-minute movie some years ago. It was called Conspiracy. And it was about an event that occurred in 1942 in Wannsee, Germany. And the meeting was hosted by Adolf Eichmann. And the head of the meeting was Reinhard Heydrich, who was the number 2 in the SS, Himmler's chief adjutant, who would become protector and he would be assigned to Prague, where he'd be assassinated. And Heydrich was the architect of the final solution. And so there was a meeting that took place, and it was over coffee and danishes and a little lunch. Most of the participants were lawyers, and they argued with each other about jurisdictional boundaries on the logistics operation, who had jurisdiction for the rounding up, the deportation, and the murder of the Jews. And then, of course, the legal framework, which would allow the Germans to do it. And they were very concerned about that the killing of the Jews be legal. And so when Adolf Eichmann was being tried in Jerusalem in 1965, literally up to the moment he was hanged, he had no idea why he was being executed, because he truthfully thought he was in the logistics business. And what Hannah Arendt, the philosopher and the writer who was covering it, she coined a phrase called the banality of evil. And she said, sitting in the courtroom, she expected to see a monster, but he was just an ordinary bureaucrat. So there was a meeting in the White House that took place in March that Jared Kushner was leading. And sure, I've been in a lot of these meetings in the White House. There was coffee and bottled water and some food on the side, and probably there was a data on a screen and folders with charts in it, and they went through the death estimates. And in the White House, a decision was made not to have a national strategy. It was made affirmatively, it was made premeditatedly, because calculus was made, we can stick any fallout on this on the blue state governors. And as a result, we will have hundreds of thousands of dead people. How do you render the evil of premeditated decisions that take place in sterile bureaucratic settings? But there's a lot of sound and fury in this Trump era. Constant motion, constant outrage, constant tweets. But there's going to come a time where artistically we need to slow it all down. And as we make it through this, and I hope we will, and we start to back up from the line, very dangerous line that Trump has brought us to, how we treat this era and what happened in it is going to require some wisdom, some talent, some genius writing, some perspective. But it seems to me it's a quieter story. than the cable news fulminations that erupt, every few minutes, 24 hours, 7 days a week. We have a decayed and corrupted system, and there was a brilliant treatment of Chernobyl that HBO did, that if you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's disturbing, it's stark, it's gray, but it portrays what happens in a decayed, corrupt, sclerotic system. And it shows what happens when the truth is assaulted and the tragedy that follows. So there's going to be, like there always is, there will be great pieces of art that come from this era. There will be revisionist pieces of art that come from this era. There will be silly pieces of art that come from this era. And there will ultimately be art that comes with the perspective of time, looking back on this, which is highly dependent on where we are. Are we recovered and renewed? Are we the United States? Or are we a nation that's very different in the sense that we're declining, we're weakening, and we're less relevant in the world, and that America has a different context in the world and in the story of the world than the one we grew up very much oriented to? And I think that's an open question.
What Steve has said has reminded me a bit of my favorite TV show. And I love Howard. I love what John's worked on. I've given your guys' shows good reviews too. But my favorite TV show is The Wire. And one of the reasons why I love The Wire is because The Wire is about systems. It's about how systems work. And it's about the fact that a cop can be as devoted as they want to be to trying to catch the bad guy, but if the system is fucked up, he's not going to make it happen. and I would love to see someone like David Simon, who writes about systems, get a crack at portraying where we are today and how we got here, because I'm convinced that part of it is that we have elected in Congress a large number of people who got there not because they were good at leveraging government to help people or solve problems, but they got there because they were good at leveraging ideology and they were good at raising money. And when you have Congress filled with enough of those people, and when you have a president in the White House who comes out of that, then when an actual emergency happens, the people who are controlling government don't know how to leverage government to stop that emergency or to help people. And they have to make that rather callous and practical decision to try and ride out the emergency and blame it on someone else because they don't know how to solve it. And ultimately, I think that's going to be the story of where we landed, what we're suffering through right now. And I'm also a believer that it takes time, it takes some distance for most TV writers and film writers to really come up with stories that actually provide insight when you go through something like this. We didn't get great stories about 9/11 right after 9/11. It took a little bit of time.
I feel a bit like the question is, how would you write about this fire that's burning your house down now?
Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly. You need some perspective.
I gotta wait to see what happens to the fire. I'm worried about, I've got kids in there. It's
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I have, let's get some questions in the queue from our audience. Since it's a little after 8:30, I'll wrap up my last question with the panel. So we are going to see portrayals of Trump in the future, obviously, as we've seen presidents portrayed in the past. Who would you cast for that role? And what kind of show would it be? Would it be a satire? Would it be a comedy?
I just say I can't wait to see Saturday Night Live this Saturday.
Yeah, right. Alec Baldwin.
So is it an Alec Baldwin, or is there some other way of portraying Trump that gets at what his presidency has meant?
I just don't think it's funny material yet. I mean, I can't even go there. Like,
there's going to be a huge allergy in the country. Look, here's the deal. Trump's not going away ever. And Trumpism is now a thing. It's a rooted ideology. It's authoritarianish. It's illiberal. It assaults the rule of law. It's corrupt. It's much closer, and the Republican Party that sustains it is much closer to Orban's autocracy in Hungary or to Erdogan's in Turkey than it is to any center-right governance in any Western liberal democracy. But he's presided over one of the great tragedies in the country's history. And all of it was preventable. And we're going to be dealing with the reality, and sometimes we get confused. We have a political issue in the country, and we have a sociological issue in the country. Right now, we're ruled over by a hardcore base of 30% of the country, the Mark Levins, the Laura Ingrahams, the Sean Hannitys, because Trump is in power. And there are more of us by a lot than there are of them. So politically, Trump's going to lose, right? A majority of the country's against this. The secondary consideration is we got 30% of the country that's full in on a cult of personality, at least. They'll never accept the legitimacy of an election in which he loses. We have 120 QAnon candidates running on Republican labels across the country. We'll have 1,200 2 years from now. So like a white star astronomically that's collapsing. As it collapses, it gets smaller, it gets denser, it gets hotter. Political parties get smaller, they get denser, they get hotter, meaning more extreme. And that's where the Republican Party is going to go. But we're going to be dealing with a hangover for a long time on this. And by the time we get done with this, right, we're going to have 400,000 at least, which will be more than the combatant casualties of the Second World War. Right, could be significantly higher, won't be less than about 425,000 dead. And so there'll never be something that's a satire of Trump that has commercial appeal or is going to be greenlit by a studio or anybody that's in this to make money as well as art. And it's going to be a very, very long time, I think, before the country is able to start to face this. And you can look at the Vietnam War, right, like through an artistic perspective on the continuum, for example, between John Wayne and the Green Berets in the late 60s, the anti-war movies from Coming Home to Deer Hunter in the 1970s, to then the revisionist movies of the 1980s, which were Rambo and Missing in Action, right? This, idea that, we're going for payback on a triumphant America. So art always echoes culture and politics, but I think it's going to be a long time on the basis of the magnitude of this disaster before there are artistic renderings of it. And you can look at a great series that was out within the last 18 months, which was The Looming Tower, which was the story of the 9/11 hijackings, right? That movie, we're talking north of 15 years to be able to render the true story of how that happened and the incompetency and malfeasance that existed between a lot of government officials, when in fact you had a couple of FBI agents who were right on the edge of catching all the hijackers. Again, another thing that didn't have to happen.
Wow, I didn't realize, Steve, you'd be such an instrumental part of this panel in talking about the arts and culture aspect of Washington politics. It's 8:39, so we're going to switch to our Q&A, and we're doing things a little differently this year, obviously, because we're online. And some of my students are serving as audience surrogates. So my students will be asking questions for our audience members. And our first student questioner is Callie.
Hi, Hannah Wiley of Newark asks, do you believe the fact that Biden's vice presidential candidate is a woman will affect Biden's chances of being elected? I am all for a female in that position of power, specifically Kamala Harris. However, in Hillary Clinton's case and even in Sarah Palin's, it seems the country's underlying misogynistic bias still accounts for many to shy away from voting for these women.
Thank you, Callie.
I don't think so. I mean, I think she's an asset, and I think we're way past that, frankly.
Steve, what do you think?
I don't look. Hillary Clinton's problem in the race, I think, was less about sex than it was about endurance. And the reality is there had never been a person in this country's history that had been as famous for as long as she had been, as polarizing as she had been, in the very center of the ring of America's public life for 26 years. The only other comparison to that is Richard Nixon, who was famous from the Alger Hiss case in 48 to 68. And he took a couple of years off and went into hiding after he lost the 62 California governor's race. No one saw him for 4 years. And so it's really hard, to elect someone who's been around for that long. And, the reality is that, and it's something that Democrats have to face, right? Which is that, no matter what Trump does, half the country says, but the Clintons did it. And a lot of the reason for that, I'll pin on Fox News and talk radio and a 30-year smear campaign, but it's not as if they didn't make it pretty easy for all those people sometimes. And so, there were a lot of factors with Hillary Clinton that go much deeper than I think her gender. Not to say that gender isn't a factor, but I don't think that Kamala Harris is a liability on the ticket. I think she's doing a great job, and I think she's going to annihilate Mike Pence in this debate for sure. I bet my legs on it. And, and I think you'll see a woman president before too long in this country.
I'm not an expert in politics, but I will say that if Joe Biden had not chosen a Black woman for his running mate, I think he would have had serious problems, because I think Black people have reached a point where they want to know that they are appreciated and that they're a constituency that will be paid attention to. And if Joe Biden had chosen a white person to be his running mate, I think Black female voters in particular would have felt insulted. So whatever problems there may be from people reacting to Kamala Harris as a woman, I think Joe Biden would have had exponentially more problems if he hadn't picked someone like her to be his running mate.
Very interesting times. All right, let's go to our next question. This comes from my student, Alyssa, who's going to give you a question from one of our audience members.
Hello. So Richard Hanley of Newark has a question for Howard. I was a huge fan of the X-Files, even though in the real world, I would be Scully and not Mulder. In the X-Files, the crazy conspiracy theorist turns out to be right and the hard-nosed scientist wrong. Isn't Trump a modern-day Mulder? Why do people feel such an affinity for the nut and not for the sensible, evidence-motivated, even-keeled person with experience?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. I think that things like conspiracy theories are post-traumatic response to a world that is just unnavigable, unknowable. I mean, even the mythologies that's about America, the American exceptionalism, the idea, the unifying things that we all sort of grew up with and thought we were, this great flower of the Enlightenment, has obviously been dismantled. Again, I think by 24-hour news, by social media, and the reductive, even the mad, but simple conspiracy theories are obviously appealing to people who, for whom truth has no currency and who just want to be told about Pizzagate or something, or so I actually find this whole thing a referendum on people. I'm disappointed, not just in my elected officials, but I'm stunned by people's so now I'm trying to go back to Mulder. I'm not sure why. I actually think one of the analyses about why X-Files was so popular, if you remember, that was actually the end of history. The wall came down, the internet was coming, and it was going to be this wonderful public commons that was going to end anyone's ideas or imprisonment, and I think we had this incipient understanding that something was terribly wrong still. And I think Mulder's because X-Files came at a time when things, history was over. We were entering a new era. The world was flat. I mean, all these books, remember the end of history, the world is flat. And we were all ready to sort of, beat our plows into, or our swords into plowshares. And that clearly didn't happen.
Yeah, fascinating. All right, well, we have another question. My student, Mark, is going to be the audience surrogate asking this question.
Hello, everyone. So
Hey.
Eugene of St. Petersburg, Florida asks, Hollywood is often accused by the right of having an enormous liberal bias. Is this a part of their bigger plan to denigrate and devalue opinions that differ from their own?
Duh. No. No, I don't think so. Howard, I mean, there's
but let's, I would say the media as well. I mean, look, the media as well. I mean, obviously everyone has their bias, and the media, I mean, Woodward and Bernstein had their biases, and they didn't like Nixon. There was, however, there were protocols, there were
there
professional guardrails to guard us against our biases.
was respect for the truth.
Yeah, there actually really was that. They're right, and so I think, but I do think, look, I have conservative friends in Hollywood who, I will say we're very lonely at dinner parties. It just is, but I'm sure it was the same thing with people who were, WashPo reporters or whatever, or Eric, I don't know, you can speak more to that, but I think that, but again, I think the question, Hugh, to is there some conspiracy or some complicity among everybody to sort of parrot liberal or progressive talking points? And I think that's I don't think that's true. I don't think it makes for good storytelling. I do think that audiences sense propaganda pretty quickly. So, and what's counterfeit and what's
Yeah, and that's largely what we're trying to do with this program is over the past 10 years is to introduce people to different viewpoints and be kind of accepting of diverse viewpoints and just to listen to various different viewpoints. So that's part of the reason we have this panel put together. Have Steve Schmidt, who left the GOP. I have lots of questions for you still about all of that, about the Lincoln Project that you've started. But Howard, you mentioned Eric. I don't know if Eric wanted to respond.
Well, I was just going to say that I have a lot of thoughts about this issue. I do think that it strains credulity to insist that amongst our sort of mainstream entertainment, network television, cable television, film, that there isn't a sort of general liberalism that is where a lot of those stories and characterizations kind of sit. I think that's true.
With that,
I do think that I have this weird thing that I've been trying to sort of investigate, where I have this sense that sometimes certain platforms are a little more receptive to certain kinds of political points of view because of the audiences that are drawn to them. So, talk radio on the AM dial and cable TV news are particular repositories for conservative thought because older people tend to use those platforms and older people tend to be more conservative. And I think one of the geniuses of Roger Ailes was that he kind of created a cable TV news channel to speak to an audience that didn't feel like it was being served by traditional mainstream news coverage. But if you look at sort of traditional documentaries, if you look at traditional network TV and cable TV news or cable TV scripted output, that's a kind of a different audience. It's younger, it's more politically liberal. And so those stories tend to sit in a different place, I think. But I also think what's happened with this conservative movement that we're facing is that it reacts in sort of extreme ways. So it will perceive the gentle liberalism of mainstream entertainment and react to that by demanding a level of fealty to conservative points of view that is really extreme. And so I think that's one reason why you're not seeing a whole lot of network television shows that are created to speak to that audience, because that audience wants that message so tailored to their beliefs and so extreme that it's tough to do. I mean, even the Roseanne, reboot struggled with that. They only had a couple of nods and a couple of episodes to that character's Trumpism, and it became this huge controversy that engulfed the show. So I do think that's an interesting thing, and I don't think we quite know why it's playing out the way it is, but I suspect that some of it is that certain audiences are gravitating to different media platforms, and so there's an economic incentive to speak to them in their language on that platform.
Yeah, there's that whole station. What's what's it called? The ask the nice questions at the White House. It's an Axio. OAN.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what we're seeing, is that Fox News isn't extreme enough for some people. So we're having more outlets created that are even more extreme, like Newsmax and OAN and Breitbart and the Daily Caller.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Well, let's move on to our next question. My student Ashley is going to be the audience surrogate for this question.
Hi, Professor Erin Cassess has a question for John Mankiewicz. So people like to criticize women candidates for their toxic ambition. Can you please tell us a little bit about Claire Underwood and how her character relates to that narrative?
It's a good question. It is, if you think she was, her character was really smart, really ambitious. I don't know if you would, she was as ambitious as Francis was. That wasn't a downside for him. It is sometimes for women. We tried to, I think in that last episode, she killed Michael Kelly in the Oval Office, if I remember correctly. So, it's not realistically, her character isn't realistically drawn. But in earlier seasons, she was, sort of much smarter than Francis, sometimes more intuitive.
But she was always cold, right?
Yeah, she was cold, and sometimes we didn't know why she was cold.
But I think the question is that because she was a woman? Is that how we see women in politics?
No, I think that was certainly, I'm thinking of the other writers that I've worked with, that was specific to her character. And I know that it's an easy answer, because the danger is you're painting all women that way, because she's a big, sort of a character that's making a lot of noise. But do you remember in the first season, the thing with the origami that she was making that was sort of a cold thing? We had no idea why she was doing that. No one who wrote the show, Bo Willimon included, he just thought origami was cool. But it lent a certain quality to her character that was certainly not meant to be a big brush painting all women. It was just for her.
All right, well, I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up. So my student Leah is going to be the audience surrogate for this one.
Shoes of Philadelphia asks, what about the positive movies about politics in the presidency? Like Dave, the American President and Designated Survivor, itself a failed experiment with a fascinating premise. Could such a movie be made today? Could it help normalize the idea that the president could be again great and good, as Steve Schmidt says?
I don't know. Was it addressed? You were muted. I don't know if it was addressed to all of us.
She was just asking everyone, like, think about positive movies about the president. Yeah. Like,
again, I think those were. I like to think the answer is yes. That we can find what we can reimagine a presidency that defines the things that unite us rather than the things that divide us. I think if to the extent that we can look at the past about what stories have done. Hopefully that's the case. I do think it's a steeper mountain to climb than in the past. Pardon, John?
It takes some time, I think.
Yeah.
It all depends on the story. If someone can find the right story, I think it's entirely possible. And in fact, I think people may need it.
May need it, yeah.
It's just that just doesn't seem to be where our head is at right now.
Yeah.
And it would be hard to create a story like that wouldn't seem naive.
Right. I think that's exactly the challenge.
Well, we had that conversation in the classroom today too about, how realistic do we want programs to look right now? Do we want people wearing masks, or do we want them, gathering in crowds? I think it's kind of difficult there's sort of there's an escapism element that we want to be able to pretend like nothing is going on, but there's also like, how do we deal with this in real life? So
we have this really segmented society too. One of the things that's interesting to me is, for example, we're a nation that's been at war for how long now? Close to 20 years.
Yeah.
And that cost is borne by like 10% of our population that we rarely pay attention to. And I sense an effort to do the same thing with coronavirus, to minimize and marginalize the people who are suffering from it, so that the rest of America can kind of chug along like nothing's going wrong. And that's part of our problem. And that's one way I think that art can help, is that art can reach out to those people who have been locked out, who've been marginalized, who've been disregarded, and constantly push us to pay attention to their stories.
And his stories haven't been told. I mean, look, Eric, that was actually interesting. That was the motivation for Alex and me when we did Homeland, was that 10 years, we'd been in a war for 10, at that point, 10 years, on two fronts. We had the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and there wasn't a single soldier on television, with the exception, I think, of maybe person of interest, some soldier who was traumatized and was, so it was just amazing to us that there was nobody asking those questions. Nobody was coming home bearing the trauma of that experience.
Well, we've got, I think, one final question that's a good one from my student, Sean, who's going to ask a question from our audience.
Hello. So the question is from an audience member and is for Howard Gordon. Carrie Matheson of Homeland is arguably one of the most complex female characters ever created. Can you please tell us more about where Carrie came from and what you hope people take away from her choices and struggles?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot more prosaic, I think, her creation than you might imagine, because we, was fishing very much in the same pond as 24. It was a very, very different show. But I sort of had to, in a very binary way, go, okay, well, Jack was a man. We want a woman. Jack was a person of a certain age. So we really took the rough contours of our hero. At the same time, the big animating question was, where are we 10 years later? What's the price of our national security? What does this American proposition of power mean after 10 years into this? Were these wars overcorrections, and have they been prosecuted recklessly? And Carrie was kind of an audience proxy for us to ask questions we really simply, as American citizens, were interested in. Alex and I were just really found ourselves just as friends, as writers, and as colleagues, just asking a bunch of questions. And Carrie was kind of the person, the fictional analog for all those questions. I mean, she really was. And the fact that she was bipolar was sort of something that, you know, was an interesting narrative construction. But also, you know, she was kind of Chicken Little, you know, and she was easily discredited pathologically, but she took a lot of work, and it was like, you know, I think after many iterations, and then Claire Danes, of course, made it something neither of us could have imagined.
You know what I love about that too is that you talked about how you guys started Homeland wanting to talk about the plight of soldiers and people returning from that war, and you ended Homeland talking about the intelligence officers who were bringing us all this in real life, bringing us all this information about Russia and bringing us all this information about you know, threats that our country's facing, that our president was blowing off, and you were exposing that too. It's a wonderful sort of cycle that you guys went through, from talking to one type of unsung hero to talking to another type. And
yeah, thanks.
Well, I think it's about time to wrap up. Thank you so much to our panelists who joined us tonight. This was fascinating and interesting and a little lighthearted in the midst of a pandemic, to think about how entertainment and TV and film can sort of give us understanding of the world and also distract us from it at the same time. So I'd like to say thank you to all of you who are here tonight. I have a couple of final comments to mention. So our next events that you'll want to participate in is our Delaware debates. We are the only institution that conducts the debates in the state of Delaware. That will be October 13th and 14th. So make sure you check cpc.udel.edu/Delaware debates to find more information. Our next National Agenda speaker is going to be on October 28th at 7:30, and that will be Mary Louise Kelly, who is the co-host of NPR's All Things Considered. And she has had an interesting year. She interviewed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo earlier this year and made headlines with that. I just want to say there's lots to discuss this year, as every election year. But right now, there's so much going on in the midst of a pandemic and a very contentious election year. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you again for our next events. cpc.udel.edu. Thank you so much.
Thank you.